This is Earth, home to 195 countries and 8 billion people. It's also home to the strangest economic paradox of our time. Every single nation on the planet is in debt. The United States owes $33 trillion. Japan owes $10.8 trillion. Even wealthy countries like Switzerland and Norway carry billions in national debt. Combined, the world's governments owe $102 trillion. That's roughly $12,750 for every person alive. But this raises an obvious question that surprisingly few people ask. If every country is borrowing money, who exactly is doing all the lending? The answer isn't what you'd expect, and understanding it reveals why your cost of living keeps rising while wages stay flat. It wasn't always like this. In 1970, total global government debt was less than $1 trillion. Countries actually had reserves, gold backing their currencies, and debt was something you paid back. But over the next 50 years, something fundamental changed about how money works. By 1990, global debt had reached $25 trillion. By 2008, it hit $65 trillion. And after the pandemic, we crossed $100 trillion for the first time in history. This isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's reshaping how entire economies function. In Japan, government debt now equals 235% of GDP, meaning the country owes more than twice what it produces in an entire year. In the US, debt service alone costs $3 billion per day, more than the entire military budget of most nations. So who actually owns all this debt? Let's start with the United States, which has the world's largest debt at $33 trillion. You might assume China owns most of it, given all the headlines. But China actually holds just $756 billion, about 2.3% of the total. Japan holds $1.14 trillion. The UK has around $700 billion. All foreign countries combined own just $8.5 trillion, or roughly 26% of total US debt. The remaining 74%, about $24.5 trillion, is held domestically. But this is where things get interesting. The largest single holder of U.S. government debt is actually the Federal Reserve, which owns $5.3 trillion in Treasury securities. This is particularly significant because the Federal Reserve is essentially part of the government. It was created by Congress and returns its profits to the Treasury. Another $7 trillion is held by government trust funds, primarily Social Security, which means the government literally owes money to itself. Commercial banks hold $4.15 trillion. Pension funds hold trillions more, and insurance companies round out the major holders. What this means is that most of America's debt is owed to American institutions, many of which are either government-created or government-guaranteed. But if you want to see this phenomenon taken to its logical extreme, look at Japan. Despite having the world's highest debt-to-GDP ratio at 235%, Japan has avoided a debt crisis for one simple reason: they owe the money to themselves. The Bank of Japan holds 46.3% of all Japanese government bonds. Domestic insurance companies own another 20%. Japanese banks hold 15%, and other domestic institutions own most of the rest. Foreign investors hold just 12% of Japanese debt. This means that when Japan pays interest on its debt, that money largely stays within Japan's economy, flowing from the government to Japanese institutions and citizens who then spend or invest it domestically. Here's something that might surprise you. If you have a pension, you're probably a government creditor. Global pension funds manage $33.9 trillion in assets, and government bonds make up their core holdings. CalPERS, California's pension system, manages $500 billion. Norway's sovereign wealth fund controls $1.9 trillion. These funds buy government bonds because they're considered the safest investment. After all, governments can always print more money to pay their debts. But this creates a circular dependency. Governments need pension funds to buy their debt, pension funds need governments to guarantee their safety, and workers need both to secure their retirement. This brings us to perhaps the most mind-bending aspect of modern debt: how central banks create money to buy government bonds. Between 2008 and 2023, central banks globally purchased $5.6 trillion worth of government bonds through what's called quantitative easing. But they didn't use existing money for these purchases. As the Bank of England openly admits, the money we used to buy bonds did not come from government taxation or borrowing. Instead, like other central banks, we can create money digitally. In other words, central banks create new money with a few keystrokes, use it to buy government bonds, and suddenly both the money supply and government debt have increased. International debt holdings follow a similar pattern of circular dependence. Countries with trade surpluses, like China, Japan, and Germany, accumulate massive amounts of foreign currency from selling goods abroad. China, for instance, receives hundreds of billions in dollars annually from its trade surplus with the US. But what can China do with all these dollars? They can't spend them domestically, so they invest them in US Treasury bonds. This means China is effectively lending America the money to buy Chinese goods. Germany does the same thing within Europe, accumulating $3.99 trillion in net external assets, making it the world's largest creditor nation. This entire system became possible after August 15, 1971, when President Nixon ended the gold standard. Before that date, currencies were backed by gold, which limited how much money governments could create and how much they could borrow. After 1971, money became purely fiat, backed by nothing except government decree and public confidence. This unleashed an explosion in both money creation and debt. Global government debt grew from virtually nothing in 1970 to $102 trillion today. Each crisis, the 1980s Latin American debt crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, the COVID pandemic, was met with more borrowing and more money printing, ratcheting the system higher each time. Commercial banks represent another layer of this circular system. U.S. banks alone hold $4.15 trillion in Treasury and agency securities. But these same banks depend on government backing through FDIC insurance, which promises to protect depositors if banks fail. During the 2008 crisis, many of these banks received taxpayer bailouts. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Bank of America. They're simultaneously creditors to the government and beneficiaries of government protection. It's a system where the government borrows from institutions it must rescue if they fail, using money it creates through institutions it controls. Here's the fundamental issue that makes the system so precarious. In our fractional reserve banking system, all money is created as debt. When a bank makes a loan, it creates new money. This means there's always more debt than money to repay it. It's mathematically impossible for all debts to be paid off simultaneously. The system requires continuous expansion, more lending, more borrowing, more money creation, just to service existing debts. This is why economists talk about the growth imperative. Without economic growth, the debt pyramid collapses. This has real consequences for ordinary people. In the United States, the government now spends 18% of all tax revenue just on interest payments, nearly double that of any other G7 nation. That's money that could go to infrastructure, education, or tax cuts. Over the next decade, interest payments alone will cost each American citizen over $40,000. Meanwhile, countries are becoming increasingly vulnerable. The U.S. debt service now exceeds its entire military budget. Even wealthy countries like France and the UK are spending 10% of their tax revenue on interest. And this is with historically low interest rates. If rates rise significantly, these costs could double or triple. There are signs that confidence in this system is starting to crack. Since 2021, China has sold $340 billion worth of U.S. bonds. Japan has reduced holdings by $200 billion. Even close allies like the UK and Canada are quietly reducing their positions. They're not doing this because they've found better investments. They're doing it because they're losing faith in the sustainability of ever-expanding debt. History shows what happens when this confidence breaks. Venezuela's money printing led to hyperinflation. Greece's debt crisis resulted in 60% youth unemployment. Argentina has defaulted 9 times. Lebanon's currency lost 90% of its value in 2 years. So every country owes money, but to whom? The answer is that we've created an elaborate circle where governments owe money to central banks they created, using currency those banks invented, held by institutions the governments guarantee, invested by pension funds the governments regulate, protected by insurance the governments backstop. It's not that someone outside the system is collecting $102 trillion. Money is debt, debt is money, and the circle keeps expanding because it must. Stopping would mean confronting the reality that much of our perceived wealth is just accounting entries in a game where everyone owes everyone else. The real question isn't who we owe, but how long this impossible arrangement can continue before reality finally intervenes.